Welcome to Absolute Trust Talk with your host, Kirsten Howe. Absolute Trust Talk brings you tips, tools, advice, and interviews to help you build a reliable knowledge base on estate planning, business, and finance to start preparing for your future today.
Hello, and welcome to Absolute Trust Talk. I'm Kirsten Howe here with Madison Gunn, my co-host. And as we promised you last time, we still are continuing our conversation with Tess Brigham, the very, very skilled and experienced psychotherapist who is here to talk to us about estate planning with multiple generations and all the different things that that means. Tess, welcome back. We are so delighted and honored to have two chances to talk to you.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
You are very welcome. So just as a recap, last time we talked about the different generations and how they are not just distinguished by the year in which they were born, but largely distinguished by what was happening in the world around them during their formative years and attitudes around what was happening around them and attitudes around parenting, all of those things. We talked a little bit about estate planning from a perspective of a baby boomer parent and a millennial child. Let's look a little bit at another parent-child pair. This one is a little more up your alley personally, Tess, the Gen X parent and the Gen Z child. So talk briefly about the attributes of those two generations, since we talked about it last time, but let's give a little refresher on those two generations.
Oh, sure. So Gen X, primarily born between 1965 and 1980. And this generation was heavily influenced by the AIDS crisis, by the Persian Gulf War, by the high divorce rates, by the women's movement affected, obviously, baby boomers. And then so what happened for their kids was a lot of women, there were more divorces and a lot of women were going back to school. And so I'm part of that generation. We're very much of this generation of, got ourselves home, latchkey kids, figured things out on our own. And we were sort of made fun of for being like just the, nobody cares, we don't care, we'll just do our thing kind of attitude. Gen Zers a little bit, they are very different. They are born between 1997 and 2012. And so these young people, they are true digital natives. They have no concept of the world before smartphones, before technology, before the internet, before any of those things. And they've been heavily influenced. Pandemic I think it's going to be very interesting to see 10, 15 years from now, the impact of the pandemic on this generation. But they've also been heavily influenced by social media and just having technology and having information at their fingertips. And I think that this part's really important because I think we forget that information is very, very powerful. And I think the older generations, we think information is much more powerful than it really is. And we're always shocked when these younger people come in and they're like, well, I already figured all this out. It's all on the web, right? Like, I know it already. So with these two generations, again, I talked about in the last episode about how as baby boomers were the first generation that said, I really want to have less kids. I want to focus on my kids more. And that was the same thing. Gen X took that on as well. We also want to have less kids. We want to be able to focus on our kids. And I think that and our own experiences of not necessarily feeling like we were completely neglected, but my sister and I do this podcast together. And we grew up in Northern California in a small town called Ukiah. And the funniest thing about Ukiah is Ukiah had so many kidnappings, so many things. And I grew up at a time, if you remember Steven Stainer, who was,
sure.
That was Ukiah. Like when I was a kid, the second boy that I always get his name wrong, but the second boy who he perpetrated,
the boy
kidnapped,
he helped free.
Yes. So Steven Stainer helped free the little boy. I was about that little boy's age. And this was talked about regularly. So I think we have all these memories of being traumatized and a little bit like there were no trigger warnings, being traumatized as kids. So we tend to be a little bit overprotective of our kids. We know all the things that are going to happen. And that coupled with all the information that's out there makes the younger generations much more risk adverse. And so I think for us, it's been a combination of what happened in our own childhood that's heavily influenced us, right? Why do we need sleepovers? Every time you hear about a sleepover, it seems to be a disaster, right? Or someone's being, so it's that coupled with the fact that we have a tremendous amount of information at our fingertips that is very overwhelming. So I do think that both of these generations, we tend to be a little more anxious.
Well, and Gen Z's coming home talking about the drills they're having at school.
Oh, sure.
Yes.
I mean, I think for me personally, I was in school when Columbine happened and that they barely just had started talking about maybe having drills. By the time I got out of high school, we didn't have that. And now they're like teaching kids to fight back.
Yeah. What do you do when there's a shooter in the building? Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Like teaching a 5-year-old what to do, it's like, what? Excuse me? And so teaching that, that fear response, that little PTSD and just those drills alone is going to, and then you go home and tell the parents.
Yeah. Well, and I also think that the amount of information that people take in, right? That there was such this rebellion. People felt like my parents, I don't know how you felt, Kirsten, but like people of older generations felt like their parents weren't listening to them or they didn't want to hear what I had to say, or they didn't share anything with me. They didn't sit down and have the sex talk. They didn't talk to me about drugs. They didn't do any of that. So as each generation has been like, I want to be more honest with my kids. I want to be more open. So the openness of Gen Xers coupled with the vast amount of information, in some ways, it sort of backfired a little bit because it's like the younger people, they have too much information and they probably don't need to know everything that they know. You don't need to know this 24-hour news cycle. This is crazy. We just make it seem like things are disastrous all the time, but it was like, because they just have to keep talking about the same story in 20 different ways.
What is that? They're doing commercials now for First 5 California about toxic stress. and
Oh,
children.
interesting.
I was like, I identify with that. Why is this for first 5 children? Why I identify with that. I'm not a child.
Yeah.
I'm not under 5. This is
We
my
all
first
need that.
5 years.
Yeah.
Because it is like that. If you,
Yeah.
you get sucked in when there's some active shooter situation in somewhere across the country and it's some national disaster, you're watching that 24-hour news cycle and it's awful.
So
because you're sucked in.
The question then becomes, right, are Gen Zers, are they risk averse because the parents have coddled them? Or are they risk averse because they see so much of this in their faces all the time? That's the question. And it's really important for parents not to be shamed, not to feel like I've done this terrible thing or I'm failing in some way, shape, or form. I think there's so much pressure on parents, especially mothers, to, be perfect all the time and nail things and make sure that they have these perfect children. And then we have these situations like the pandemic where kids get taken out of the kind of quote unquote norm. And then parents feel like, oh, what have I done wrong? Or my kid's broken or whatever it is. And it's like, well, no, not necessarily, no, that's not true. It's just that now, the path to becoming an adult looks very different than it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago,
The one thing, if we're thinking about estate planning, and it's not all that obvious all the time, but I do sort of notice that when I have that conversation with my younger parents, and I'm thinking they're probably Gen X, not real young, not millennial young, but Gen X, they do, and maybe the boomers too, they do seem to be more concerned about things like, well, what if my children get divorced? I protect things for them. Whereas my older parents, I think they just like, oh, it'll be fine. Just let them have the money. They don't feel as protective in that way. And I think that, Tess, what you've been saying, that huge increase in the rates of divorce during your years probably contributed to that.
Yeah.
They're shying away from having their kids be administering their estate after they pass away. They're also like, I don't want to burden them with this big job. As Gen X and even boomers are administering their parents' estates, they're like, this is for the birds. I don't want my kids to have to deal with this. And so they're shying away from that as well, because they're like, oh, I don't want my children to have to deal with this. Or this is too big of a project. They're realizing that it's like, that's too much for them. And whether that's a coddling or just a realization that it's a burden, I don't know.
Well, I think it's really, that very much has to do with parenting and how parents see their roles, because it used to be, and I've talked to so many audiences, and I'll hear this from baby boomers where they will say, I was told by my parents, life is hard, suck it up, here you go. There was this attitude of, I went through it, I dealt with it, now you have to deal with it, this is life. And as the generations have gotten older, for example, my parents are divorced and father remarried very quickly, and that impacted my life. And the thing was that, I don't think that my father really, he didn't think that much about how it would impact us. But my sister and I were highly aware of this is how it impacted us. So then we turn to our kids, we can see all the things that impacted us and hurt us and derailed us and made our lives hard. And so in some ways, I'm not saying it's better or worse. I'm just saying that we tend to want to protect our kids. Like, oh my God, I took care of my parents' estate, so I don't want to do that to my kid. And then that's just the attitude of what is life all about.
Everyone's trying to break a cycle.
Yes.
Like in their mind. Yes.
Yeah. Well, and sort of related to that is that I do feel as though maybe the younger parents are more amenable to other suggestions, like let's protect the inheritance, but also things like, well, I don't want them to have to do this job because I'm afraid about it affecting the sibling relationships. I don't want to have one child be the trustee and now everybody's mad at that child. I think my younger-ish parents, not in the silent generation, not the older baby boomers, but the younger ones are more in tune to that. That's part of my legacy too, is that I leave behind an intact family. And they are maybe more open to suggestions about, well, we could have a professional do this job. It doesn't have to be one of the kids.
It's not just duty over family. It's just,
you're the oldest child. It's your job.
Right.
Just suck it up. I also sort of related to what we've been talking about is maybe a little bit of the reverse in which the child is taking responsibility or caring for their elderly parents. And they could be boomers, they could be Gen X children now taking responsibility for their elderly parents. And of course, I probably don't need to say this, but the classic scenario is it's the oldest daughter. The oldest daughter is doing all the work, taking care of the parents. Not always, but often enough that it's probably an accurate stereotype. And I'm wondering if the experiences and the way younger generations were raised or are being raised might affect that stereotype.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is interesting because you're absolutely right. I mean, unfortunately, the oldest female has always had that responsibility, right? That responsibility of mothering and being the second mother. I mean, it will be interesting to see because people have less and less kids. So there's less of those dynamics that people have to negotiate. But I think that for some people, there's that feeling of what is fair and fairness. And, I think that as the generations have gone along, as Madison said, as we tried to figure out what are the cycles, how do we break this cycle? Some of this is if you felt like things were unfair in your family, then you're going to be hyper aware of what is fair. So a lot of these things are about the generation. It's about the time in which you were born and all of that. But there's also what are the things that happened in your family and how did you interpret those things?
Sure.
And how did that impact you? But I do think that it'll be interesting to see if it still lands to the oldest female, or if as the generations go along, they do change it up a bit. Or
I'm thinking about maybe starting with millennials, the responsibilities related to childcare and, just running a household they seem to be doing a better job, or at least trying, or being more conscious about making it more equitable so that all of the work of the household doesn't land on the mother, which was traditional, because traditionally the mother didn't work. And so that made sense. But now most women do work. So it doesn't necessarily make sense. And just maybe having that more even distribution might result in the sons stepping up and taking care of their own parents instead of the daughter-in-law taking care of the son's parents, which we see that a lot too.
Yeah.
You know, if you don't have an oldest daughter, well, then you're going to marry one and she's going to be your oldest daughter.
Maybe a better equitable division of labor over long term will eventually equate to a better equitable division of emotional labor.
Yes.
Over the generation.
Well, that would be nice too.
Yes.
That would be good. That would be good. One can only hope.
But the problem is that, you know, what we know about men and women and being able to study brain sciences is that some of this stuff is a bit, you know, it's generational, but it's innate.
It's it's evolutionary. Yeah.
Women are always going to be more with the emotional labor. And I think that's why it falls to the oldest daughter of the women, because they're the ones thinking about these things. I just feel like a lot of the men, it's not meant to be, they don't intend to be, but they're just not thinking about how this is impacting the family, because that's what we're constantly thinking about, right? It's like, how does all this impact other people?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I mean, we've evolved over many, many hundreds of thousands of years to be the way we are.
Yeah.
And we can't undo that in a couple of generations. But, you know, we can talk about it. We can try real hard.
Definitely that happens more as generations.
Sure.
More talking.
More talking. Yes, this is what I need and this is not happening and we need to make some changes. Yeah. So yeah, it'll be very interesting to watch who's taking care of Madison when she's an elderly parent.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah. Okay. Tess, thank you so much for your time here today and your expertise. And this has been really interesting for us.
I'm glad. Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And I love hearing your stories and sort of what your experiences are, because it's a very different flavor than what I get in my world. And it is really interesting to hear these stories of how people, right? Because these are heavy duty conversations that you're having, right? Like how, you know, when it's time to think about dying, like how do people respond?
Look at it.
So that's fascinating.
Ours tends to be more top down view and yours is maybe more bottom up view. Your clients tend to be the younger and I tend to be the older. And so I think that's why it's really valuable to have this conversation with you. Madison, thank you, of course. And our guest today has been Tess Brigham. We're so grateful to have her here and we look forward to connecting with you next time.
Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Absolute Trust Talk Live. If you enjoyed listening in, then don't forget to subscribe. You can find us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you may listen by searching Absolute Trust Talk. While you're there, we would also love for you to leave us a review. And then why not share your favorite episodes with family, friends, or colleagues too? You can find all of our shows and corresponding show notes by visiting absolutetrustcouncil.com. You'll also find a variety of other free resources, including our ebooks, videos, blogs, presentations, and more. If you need help with your estate planning or administration, we also offer a free discovery call to help get the process started. You can find more information on booking your session by visiting absolutetrustcouncil.com/scheduling. If you join us for the broadcast, you can submit questions during the show. But if not, don't worry. You can always get in touch with us by sending a quick message to info@absolutetrustcouncil.com. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you soon.
This podcast is not meant to take the place of legal advice from an attorney and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you do have a legal question or issue, please consult with an attorney.